He thought he could humiliate her in front of everyone. But he had no idea he had just chosen the worst possible person. The late afternoon sun filtered through the tall glass windows of Iron Forge Gym, casting long golden streaks across the polished mats, where the rhythmic sound of feet sliding and controlled breathing filled the air, a steady pulse of discipline and quiet pride. Derek Cole stood at the center, his black belt tied perfectly, posture straight, voice sharp as he corrected a student's stance with a slight shake of his head, the kind of authority that didn't need to raise itself to be felt. Around him, a small crowd of members watched, some stretching, others pretending not to stare, all aware that this space revolved around him. Then the door opened. Claire Whitman stepped inside without urgency, her presence so unassuming it almost slipped past notice, wearing a simple gray hoodie, faded jeans, and sneakers that had clearly seen better days, her hair pulled back in a loose tie, her eyes calm, observant, unbothered by the curious glances that followed her every step. She paused near the edge of the mat, taking in the room, the movements, the energy, as if measuring something invisible, something no one else could see. Derek noticed her almost immediately, not because she stood out, but because she didn't. And to someone like him, that was invitation enough. He turned slightly, folding his arms, his gaze narrowing just enough to signal interest mixed with quiet amusement. "You lost," he called out, his voice carrying across the room with ease, drawing attention like a spotlight snapping on. A few chuckles rippled through the group. Claire looked at him, not offended, not flustered, just steady. "I'm here to train," she replied softly, her voice calm, almost too calm for the room that thrived on dominance and display. Derek smirked, exchanging a glance with one of his senior students before stepping closer, each footstep deliberate against the mat. "This isn't a beginner class," he said, tilting his head slightly, the tone polite on the surface but edged underneath, the kind of sentence designed to place someone exactly where he believed they belonged. Claire didn't move, didn't explain, didn't defend herself. She simply stood there, her posture relaxed, her hands loosely at her sides, as if none of it required a response. That silence lingered, and in that silence, something subtle shifted. Derek's smile tightened just a fraction. He wasn't used to that kind of stillness. Most people filled the gap with nervous laughter, apologies, excuses. She offered none. Around them, the room grew quieter, curiosity replacing amusement, eyes flicking between the instructor and the woman who refused to react the way she was expected to. Derek let out a short breath through his nose, then gestured toward the mat with a casual flick of his hand. "All right," he said, louder now, turning slightly so the others could hear. "Let's make this simple. You want to train? Show me what you've got." A few students shifted, sensing the change in tone, the moment turning into something more than just a passing comment. Claire's gaze dropped briefly to the mat, then lifted again, meeting his eyes with the same steady calm. No challenge, no hesitation, just quiet agreement. And as she stepped forward, placing one foot onto the mat, the light catching briefly on her face, something in the room tightened, like the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for something no one could quite name yet. Claire's foot settled onto the mat with a soft, almost weightless sound, but the effect rippled outward in a way no one expected, like a quiet note that somehow silenced an entire room without effort. And for a brief moment, even the usual background noise of gloves brushing and sneakers shifting seemed to fade into something distant, something irrelevant, because now all attention had narrowed into a single point, her and Derek, standing just a few feet apart under the warm overhead lights. That suddenly felt harsher, more revealing. Derek tilted his head slightly, studying her with a sharper focus now, the easy amusement still there, but edged with something more deliberate, as if he were recalculating, trying to decide whether she was worth the performance he had already set in motion, and behind him, a few of the more experienced students exchanged subtle looks, sensing that this had gone from casual entertainment to something that demanded closer attention. "All right," Derek said, his voice measured, slower this time, as he adjusted his stance just enough to signal that this was no longer just a joke. "Show me your stance." Claire did not rush. She did not glance around for approval or guidance. She simply shifted her weight, placing her feet with quiet precision, her posture aligning in a way that looked simple to the untrained eye, but carried a balance that felt almost too controlled, too intentional for someone who was supposed to be new. One of the students near the edge frowned slightly, arms crossing, unable to explain why something about it did not look like a beginner's uncertainty. Derek noticed it too. His eyes narrowed for just a fraction of a second before his expression smoothed over again. But the crack had already formed, small, nearly invisible, yet undeniable. "Not bad," he said, though his tone lacked the casual mockery from before, replaced now by something that hovered between curiosity and quiet challenge. And he took a step closer, slow and deliberate, testing the space between them like someone checking the depth of water before diving in. Claire's gaze followed him, steady and unblinking, her breathing even, her shoulders relaxed in a way that seemed almost out of place in a room where tension usually built visibly, where nerves showed in clenched jaws and tightened fists. But she carried none of that, only a stillness that felt deliberate, like a choice rather than a default. Around them, the room had fully settled into silence now, the kind that did not need to be announced, where even those who had been casually watching were now leaning slightly forward, drawn in by something they could not quite define, a subtle shift in energy that made the moment feel heavier than it should have been. Derek exhaled slowly, circling just a half step to the side, testing her reaction, expecting hesitation, a misstep, something he could point out, correct, use to re-establish control in front of his audience. But Claire adjusted with him, not aggressively, not reactively, just enough to remain aligned, as if she had anticipated the movement before it happened. That was when the first real flicker of doubt crossed his face. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but it was there, and one of the senior students caught it, their posture straightening slightly as they watched more closely now, no longer amused. "You trained before?" Derek asked, his voice lower, quieter, no longer projecting for the room, but directed solely at her, as if the answer mattered more than he had intended. Claire did not answer immediately. She let the question hang in the air for a second longer than expected, her eyes steady on his, and when she finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost neutral, a little. The words were simple, but they did not land like an admission. They landed like a warning. And something in Derek's posture shifted again, subtle but real, his shoulders tightening just enough, his stance adjusting just a fraction more seriously than before, because whatever this was, whatever she was, it was no longer something he could dismiss. And for the first time since she had walked through that door, the control he had assumed was his began to feel uncertain, like it might slip if he was not careful. The room felt it too. No one spoke. No one moved. They were all waiting now, not for a demonstration, but for an answer to a question that had not yet been asked out loud. Who exactly had just stepped onto that mat? The moment he realized something was off, it was already too late to step back. Derek held her gaze for a second longer than he intended, searching for hesitation, for doubt, for anything that would confirm his original assumption. But Claire gave him nothing, no nervous shift, no defensive tension, just that same steady calm that now felt less like passivity and more like control, the kind that did not need to prove itself because it already knew exactly where it stood. He took a slow breath, then gave a short nod, as if deciding to move forward anyway, because backing down now, in front of everyone, was not an option he would allow himself. "All right," he said, his voice carrying again, though it had lost some of its earlier sharpness. "Let us keep this simple." He gestured lightly with his hand, signaling a basic demonstration, something safe, something controlled, something he could guide. But Claire did not move immediately. Instead, she watched him, as if waiting for something else, something more real, and that pause stretched just long enough to shift the weight of the moment again. One of the students near the wall swallowed, suddenly aware that this was no longer a casual lesson. Derek stepped in, not aggressively, but with intention, testing distance, expecting her to react late, to misread, to give him something predictable, but she adjusted before he completed the motion, her positioning precise without looking forced, her balance centered in a way that made his approach feel unnecessary, almost redundant. A flicker of confusion crossed his face, quickly masked, but not quickly enough. "Relax," he said, forcing a small smile, though it did not reach his eyes. "You are a little tense." Claire's expression did not change. If anything, it softened slightly, not in submission, but in quiet acknowledgement, as if she understood exactly what he was trying to do and chose not to engage with it. The room had gone completely still now, every set of eyes locked onto them, the earlier amusement gone, replaced by something sharper, something closer to anticipation. Derek shifted again, this time with more clarity, more focus, attempting to guide the interaction into something he could control, but Claire moved with him in the same measured rhythm, never ahead, never behind, always exactly where she needed to be, like she was not reacting at all, but simply existing in a space he had not fully accounted for. That was when the certainty began to slip. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone could point to immediately, but in the smallest details, the slight tightening of his jaw, the fraction of a second hesitation before each movement, the way his eyes began to study rather than dismiss. "Where did you train?" he asked, quieter now, the question slipping out before he could stop it, no longer for the audience, but for himself. Claire inhaled slowly, then exhaled, her gaze steady, her voice even. "Different places," she said, the answer vague, almost dismissive, but it carried a weight that settled into the space between them like a quiet warning. Derek nodded once, though it was more reflex than agreement, his mind already recalibrating, trying to piece together what he was seeing with what he believed should be happening, and failing to make them match. Behind him, one of the senior students straightened fully now, arms uncrossing, attention sharpened, because whatever this was, it was no longer a demonstration, and everyone in the room could feel it, even if they could not yet explain it. Derek took one final step, committing to the moment, because stepping back would mean admitting something he was not ready to admit, and Claire met him there, not with force, not with aggression, but with a presence that absorbed the movement, redirected it with almost invisible precision, her hands guiding rather than resisting, her posture unwavering, and in that single, controlled exchange, something shifted completely, something undeniable, something that did not need to be loud to be. Absolute. The room froze. Not from shock, not from spectacle, but from recognition. Derek stopped. Completely. His breath caught, his posture held in a position he had not intended, his expression no longer confident, no longer amused, but searching, confused, as if trying to understand how he had arrived there without noticing the moment it changed. And Claire? She did not press forward. She did not capitalize on it. She simply held the position for a fraction of a second, then released, stepping back with the same quiet control she had shown from the beginning, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. No one spoke. No one moved. Because in that brief, silent moment, everyone had just seen the truth, and it was nothing like what they had expected. Respect does not disappear in a moment. It shifts, quietly, from one person to another. Derek remained still for a second longer than necessary, his body no longer moving with the easy confidence that had defined him just minutes earlier, his mind racing to catch up with what had just happened, trying to label it, explain it, reduce it to something manageable, but every explanation fell short, because nothing about that exchange had felt accidental. Claire had not overpowered him. She had not forced anything. She had simply been in control, and that realization settled deeper than anything visible. Around them, the room held its silence like something fragile, no one daring to break it, as if speaking too soon might shatter whatever truth had just revealed itself in those few quiet seconds. Derek slowly straightened, adjusting his stance, but the movement lacked its earlier sharpness, replaced now by a careful awareness, as if he was suddenly conscious of every detail, every angle, every possible mistake. His eyes lifted to meet Claire's again, and for the first time, there was no trace of mockery there, no performance, only a question he had not yet found the words to ask. Claire stood exactly where she had stepped back, her posture relaxed, her breathing steady, her expression unchanged, as if the moment that had just unsettled the entire room had been nothing more than a passing exercise. She did not look at the others. She did not acknowledge the silence. She simply waited. One of the students near the back shifted slightly, the soft squeak of rubber against the mat sounding louder than it should have, drawing a few quick glances before stillness returned again. Derek exhaled slowly, running a hand briefly along the edge of his belt, a familiar gesture that once grounded him, but now felt different, less certain. "You said you trained a little," he said, his voice quieter, stripped of the earlier edge, each word chosen more carefully than before. Claire gave a small nod, nothing more. The simplicity of it carried more weight than any explanation could have. Derek let out a short breath that almost resembled a quiet laugh, though there was no humor in it, only recognition. That was not a little, he admitted, not loudly, not for the room, but enough for those closest to hear, and the words seemed to ripple outward anyway, because everyone had already understood. A subtle shift passed through the group, shoulders lowering, expressions changing, the earlier assumptions dissolving into something closer to respect, though no one said it out loud. Claire tilted her head slightly, as if considering whether to respond, then simply said, "Sometimes it is enough." Her voice remained calm, but the meaning settled into the space between them with quiet certainty. Derek nodded once, slower this time, absorbing it, not as a challenge, but as a fact he could no longer ignore. He took a step back, creating space, not out of retreat, but out of acknowledgement, a silent adjustment that spoke louder than anything he could have said. The dynamic had changed. Completely. No announcement marked it. No one declared it. But everyone felt it. The authority he had carried so effortlessly before had not vanished, but it had been reshaped, no longer built on assumption, but now forced to stand on something real. Claire did not move to claim anything. She did not step forward, did not seek recognition, did not look around for approval. She simply remained where she was, as if the moment had never been about proving anything at all. The overhead lights hummed softly, the outside world continuing beyond the glass windows as if nothing had changed, but inside that room, something had. Derek glanced briefly toward the others, noticing the way they now looked at Claire, not with curiosity, but with a quiet respect that had not been there before, and for a brief second, something unspoken passed through his expression, not resentment, not embarrassment, but understanding. He turned back to her, drawing a slow breath, and for the first time since she had walked in, his voice carried no weight of judgment when he spoke. "Show me again," he said, not as a command, not as a test, but as a request. And in that moment, the room did not hold its breath in anticipation of a performance, but in recognition that something far more important was about to unfold. The difference between arrogance and mastery is what happens when the noise disappears. Derek did not move immediately after he spoke, his words still hanging in the air, quieter than anything he had said before, yet heavier than all of it combined. And for a moment, it was unclear whether Claire would even respond, because she had never come here to perform, never stepped forward to prove anything, and yet somehow, the entire room now revolved around what she would do next. Claire looked at him, her expression unchanged, her eyes steady, as if measuring not his request, but his intent, and in that brief pause, something deeper settled into place, something unspoken, but understood by both of them. Then she nodded. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it shifted everything. Derek adjusted his stance again, slower this time, more deliberate, no longer assuming control, but seeking understanding, his posture open in a way it had not been before, and when he stepped forward, it was not to test her, but to meet her, to feel what he had missed the first time. Claire moved with him, not faster, not stronger, just precisely aligned, her presence quiet but undeniable, and as their movements connected again, something became clear to everyone watching. This was not about speed, or force, or dominance. It was about awareness, about timing so exact it felt almost invisible, about control that never needed to announce itself because it was always there. Derek shifted, adjusting his balance, attempting to read her center, but every time he thought he found it, it was not there anymore, not because she moved away, but because she had never been where he assumed she was. And that realization unfolded slowly, layer by layer, like a truth that refused to be rushed. Claire guided the motion, subtle, almost effortless, her hands never forcing, only redirecting, her posture steady, her breathing calm, and within seconds, the outcome revealed itself again, not dramatically, not explosively, but with quiet certainty. Derek paused, his movement halted not by resistance, but by understanding, his body simply recognizing that continuing would not change anything. The room went completely silent. No shifting feet, no whispered comments, just stillness. Derek exhaled slowly, a breath he did not realize he had been holding. And this time, when he stepped back, it was not out of confusion, but acceptance, a clear acknowledgement that what stood in front of him was something he had not fully understood before. He looked at Claire, really looked at her now, not her clothes, not her quiet demeanor, but the clarity in her presence, the discipline in her stillness, the control in every small movement, and something in his expression softened, not weakened, but grounded. That was clean, he said, the words simple, but sincere, and for the first time, there was no performance behind them. Claire gave a slight nod, nothing more, as if the moment did not require explanation. Around them, the students shifted, the tension easing, replaced by something quieter, something more thoughtful, as they processed what they had just witnessed, not a display, not a victory, but a lesson they had not expected to receive. Derek glanced briefly at the group, then back at Claire, and a faint, almost reluctant smile touched his face, not of amusement, but of respect earned the only way it ever truly is, through truth revealed without noise. You could teach half of them in here, he said, not as flattery, but as a recognition he could no longer ignore. Claire's eyes softened just slightly, but her answer remained the same calm, grounded simplicity that had defined her from the beginning. They will learn, she said quietly. Derek held her gaze for a moment longer, then gave a small nod, stepping aside just enough to open the space, not as an instructor directing a class, but as someone who understood that sometimes the person you least expect to lead is the one who already knows the way. And in that quiet shift, without announcement, without applause, the room changed, because that day, everyone present had just witnessed something rare, not a display of power, but a reminder of what real mastery looks like when it does not need to prove itself at all. Respect, once earned, does not fade back into what it used to be. It transforms the space around it. And that transformation now settled fully across Iron Forge Gym, like a quiet shift no one could ignore. Derek remained slightly to the side, no longer at the center by default, his posture relaxed but attentive, watching Claire not as an outsider to be measured, but as someone whose presence had already redefined the room. The students, who had once looked to him for every correction, now found their attention drifting back to her, not out of disloyalty, but out of curiosity, a deeper need to understand what they had just witnessed. Claire, however, did not step forward to claim anything. She adjusted her sleeve lightly, her movements unhurried, as if the moment had already passed for her, as if what had just unfolded was not an event, but simply a reflection of something she carried every day. One of the younger students, a woman standing near the back, hesitated before taking a small step closer, her voice careful but genuine when she spoke. How did you know where to move? The question hung in the air, not loud, but filled with something more meaningful than all the earlier laughter combined. Claire looked at her, her expression softening just slightly, not with superiority, but with understanding. I did not move to win, she said calmly, her voice steady enough for the group to hear without effort. I moved to listen. A subtle ripple passed through the room, not confusion, but realization beginning to take shape, because what she described was not something they had been trained to focus on. Derek's eyes shifted slightly as he listened, his expression thoughtful now, absorbing her words in a way that suggested he was reconsidering more than just the last few minutes. Listen to what? Another student asked, leaning forward slightly, drawn in despite themselves. Claire paused for a moment, as if choosing her words carefully, then replied, to balance, to intention, to the space between movement. The simplicity of her explanation contrasted with the depth behind it, and for a moment, no one spoke, because they all understood, in their own way, that what she described could not be memorized or copied, only learned through something deeper than technique. Derek stepped forward again, but this time there was no tension in it, no attempt to reclaim control, only a quiet willingness to stand beside rather than in front. You trained longer than you said, he noted, not as an accusation, but as a recognition. Claire met his gaze, her answer as measured as before. Long enough to know when to stop counting. The words settled into the space with quiet weight, and Derek gave a small nod, accepting it without needing more. Around them, the students began to shift slightly, not out of discomfort, but out of a growing awareness that the room they had entered earlier that day was no longer the same. that something fundamental had been revealed, something that challenged the way they had understood progress, strength, even respect. Claire glanced briefly toward the exit, the fading sunlight now casting longer shadows across the floor, then back to the group, her presence still calm, still grounded. She had not come to change anything. And yet, everything had changed. Derek exhaled slowly, then turned slightly toward the class, his voice carrying once more, but different now, stripped of performance, grounded in something more real. "We start again," he said, not as a reset, but as an acknowledgement that what came next could not be built on what came before. And as the students repositioned themselves, more focused, more aware, their movements quieter, more deliberate, Claire stepped back from the center, returning to the edge of the mat where she had first stood, as if she had never intended to stay there at all. But this time, no one overlooked her. Because now they knew, sometimes the quietest person in the room is not the least experienced, but the one who understands the most. Mastery does not announce itself. It reveals itself in what others begin to notice after it is gone. The class resumed, but nothing moved the way it had before, every step now more deliberate, every breath more measured, as if the room itself had learned something it could not unlearn. Derek walked slowly between the students, offering guidance, but his tone had changed, no longer sharp or performative, instead quieter, more precise, as though he was listening just as much as he was teaching. Every so often, his eyes drifted toward Claire, who remained near the edge of the mat, observing, her posture relaxed, her presence steady, never imposing, yet impossible to ignore. One of the senior students attempted a movement, repeating what Derek had demonstrated earlier, but this time it felt off, not incorrect, just incomplete, and after a moment of hesitation, he glanced toward Claire without even realizing he was doing it. She noticed, not immediately, not dramatically, but with the same quiet awareness she had shown from the beginning. She stepped forward just slightly, not to take over, but to adjust the smallest detail, a shift of balance, a subtle repositioning of the foot, and then she stepped back again, leaving the student to process it on his own. The difference was immediate, not visible in a flashy way, but in the ease that followed, the movement suddenly aligning in a way that made sense. The student blinked, surprised, then nodded slowly, understanding something he had struggled to grasp before. Across the room, others began to notice the same pattern, not through instruction, but through observation, through the quiet corrections that required no explanation. Derek watched it all unfold, his arms loosely crossed, not with authority, but with thought, recognizing that what Claire offered was not something that could be replicated through commands or repetition. It was something deeper, something earned through time and experience. He stepped closer to her, lowering his voice as he spoke. "You do not correct much." Claire's eyes remained on the class as she replied, "They already know. They just need to feel it." Derek nodded slightly, the words settling in, reshaping something in the way he viewed his own role, not as someone who controlled every detail, but as someone who guided others toward understanding. The room continued to move, but the energy had changed completely, no longer driven by proving or competing, but by learning, by awareness, by a quiet respect that did not need to be spoken. One of the younger students paused mid-step, clearly frustrated, then glanced toward Claire, hesitating before asking, "How do you stay so calm?" Claire turned her head slightly, considering the question, then answered with the same steady simplicity, "You stop trying to win." The student frowned, confused at first, but something in the tone, in the certainty behind it, made her reconsider, and she nodded slowly, returning to her stance with a different mindset. Derek exhaled quietly, a faint smile touching his expression, not out of amusement, but recognition, because what Claire was showing them was not a technique. It was a perspective, one that changed everything without force. The class moved through the final minutes in a way no one had expected when they first walked in, quieter, sharper, more connected, and when Derek finally called for a pause, the silence that followed was not empty. It was full, filled with something new, something understood. Claire stepped back again toward the edge, as she had done before, her role never claimed, never announced, and yet now fully recognized. Derek looked around the room, then back at her, his voice steady as he spoke. "You changed the way they see." Claire gave a small shake of her head, her gaze calm. They changed it themselves. And in that moment, it became clear to everyone watching, real strength does not force itself into the center. It simply stands quietly until the world learns to see it. By the time the session neared its end, something unspoken had settled into every corner of the room. Not loud, not dramatic, but permanent in a way that no instruction could undo. And even the smallest movements now carried a level of awareness that had not existed before. The students no longer rushed through drills or glanced around for approval. Instead, they moved with intention, each step measured, each adjustment felt rather than forced, as if they had finally understood that what they were practicing was not just physical, but something deeper, something that could not be rushed or performed. Derek stood near the center, watching, but not interrupting, his usual instinct to correct every detail replaced by something quieter, something closer to observation. And as he looked across the room, his gaze paused once more on Claire. She had not moved from her place near the edge, her presence unchanged, her posture relaxed, her attention steady. But now, the difference was not in her, it was in how everyone else saw her. One of the senior students approached her cautiously, not with the confidence he had carried earlier, but with respect that had been earned without a single word being demanded. "Do you teach somewhere?" he asked, his voice careful, almost hesitant. Claire looked at him, her expression calm, her answer simple. "No." The student blinked, clearly expecting more, but she offered nothing beyond that, and somehow, that made the answer feel complete. Derek stepped closer, hearing the exchange, his presence no longer dominating, but grounding, and for a moment, he simply stood there beside her, both of them watching the class continue in its new rhythm. "You could," he said after a pause, his tone thoughtful, not persuasive, just stating what had become obvious to everyone. Claire's eyes shifted slightly toward the students, observing their movements, their growing awareness, then back to Derek. "Teaching is not telling," she replied quietly. "It is knowing when to say nothing." Derek let out a slow breath, the corners of his mouth lifting just slightly, not in amusement, but in understanding, because for the first time in a long time, he realized how much of what he had been doing was built on filling silence instead of respecting it. Around them, the class continued, but now, something remarkable was happening. The students were correcting themselves, adjusting without being told, pausing to feel instead of rushing to finish. And it was not because someone had instructed them to do so. It was because they had seen what it looked like when everything aligned without force. A quiet confidence began to replace the earlier tension, not arrogance, but clarity, and it spread through the room in a way that could not be traced back to a single moment. Yet everyone knew exactly where it had started. Derek glanced at Claire again, then at the space she occupied, and for a brief second, something like realization crossed his face, not about her, but about himself, about the way he had measured skill, the way he had defined strength, and how incomplete those definitions now felt. He turned toward the class once more, his voice steady, but softer than before. "That is enough for today," he said, and the words carried differently now, not as an ending, but as a pause, a moment to absorb what had been learned beyond technique. The students slowly relaxed, stepping back, some exchanging quiet looks, others lost in thought, processing something they could not fully put into words yet. Claire stepped away from the mat, moving toward the exit with the same quiet presence she had entered with. No announcement, no acknowledgement, just a simple departure. Derek watched her go, not calling out, not stopping her, because something told him that whatever she had brought into that room was not meant to be held onto, but understood. As the door opened and the fading sunlight framed her silhouette for just a moment before she stepped outside, the room remained still, not out of shock, but out of recognition, because everyone there knew that they had just witnessed something rare, something that could not be repeated on command. And long after she was gone, the silence she left behind did not feel empty. It felt like a lesson that would stay with them far longer than any demonstration ever could. The room did not return to what it was before, because once you see the truth, you cannot unsee it. The door had already closed behind Claire, the soft click barely audible, yet it echoed in a way that lingered far longer than expected, as if it marked the end of something unseen and the beginning of something no one had prepared for. Inside Iron Forge Gym, no one rushed to speak. No one laughed. Even the smallest movements felt intentional now, like each person was aware that the space they stood in had quietly shifted beneath them. Derek remained near the center of the mat, but for the first time, he did not feel like the center of anything. His eyes rested briefly on the door where she had exited, then slowly moved back across the room, taking in the faces of his students, the way they stood, the way they held themselves differently now, not waiting for instruction, but thinking, observing, processing. He exhaled slowly, a long breath that seemed to carry more than just the moment, and without raising his voice, he spoke. What you saw today was not about technique. The words settled into the silence, not as a lecture, but as a realization he was forming in real time. Hey. Few students nodded slightly. Others remained still, listening in a way they had not before, not because they had to, but because they wanted to understand. Derek walked a few steps across the mat, his pace unhurried, his posture no longer projecting authority, but grounded in something quieter. Most people train to control the outcome, he continued, his voice steady. But what she showed was control without needing an outcome. The sentence lingered, and for a moment, no one responded, because it challenged something deeper than form or skill. It challenged the way they had all been thinking. One of the younger students lowered her gaze slightly, replaying the moment in her mind, the stillness, the timing, the absence of force, and slowly, she nodded to herself, as if something had finally made sense. Derek paused, then looked back toward the edge of the mat where Claire had stood earlier, now empty, but not forgotten. I thought I understood what mastery looked like, he said quietly, almost to himself, though everyone heard it. But I was only seeing part of it. No one interrupted. No one needed to. Because in that moment, his words were not instructions, they were admissions, and that made them heavier, more real. Across the room, the students shifted slightly, not out of discomfort, but out of awareness, each of them carrying a piece of what had just happened, each of them beginning to understand that progress was not just about doing more, but about understanding more. Derek stopped moving, standing still now, his gaze steady, his voice calm as he spoke one final time. From now on, do not just practice what you see, he said, practice what you feel. The room remained quiet, but it was no longer the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence of understanding beginning to take root. Outside, the last light of the day faded slowly, casting longer shadows through the windows, but inside, something clearer had taken its place.